Washington, D.C. is a city steeped in history. Little known is that it's home to one of the largest arson sprees in U.S. history. In setting hundreds of fires, the arsonist left clues to his identity. And in the ashes, scientists found them. Just before dawn, there was a house fire in a middle-class suburb of Washington, D.C. Firefighters put it out before anyone was hurt, but it was clear it was deliberately set.
There was someone in the home at the time. He had to have known it, and he didn't seem to care.
The fire originated on the front porch, where investigators found remnants of a melted plastic gallon container and a cloth wick.
And there was some fabric material that was present, which turned out to be consistent with an athletic sock.
This was the second fire in the city in less than a week. Both had been set the same way, with an accelerant inside a plastic 1-gallon container. A gas chromatography test of the debris identified the accelerant as gasoline.
They were being set in the early morning hours, between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. They were occurring at single-family residences, and the origin of the fire was being found either in the front porch or the rear porch of these homes.
The cloth wick gave the arsonist plenty of time to get away.
None of us had seen that type of device before. We were so used to having Molotov cocktails. We were lighting them, throwing them against the structure. This was one that was actually being placed against a structure, and basically you're lighting it and walking away.
Investigators from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, found another interesting item in the debris. Remnants of plastic shopping bags revealed how the arsonist carried the containers of gasoline and avoided detection.
And when you're dealing with one individual who has showed a pattern of using a device which we had not seen on the street very frequently, we knew that was going to be a very difficult case.
Investigators urged citizens to be on the lookout for individuals carrying plastic shopping bags in the middle of the night between 2 and 6 a.m.
The public needs to know this. They need to know they have a serial arsonist in their neighborhood, just like you need to know there's a rapist working in your neighborhood.
But it didn't help. Over the next 2 weeks, there were 4 more fires, all within a few miles of one another, all set with gasoline inside a plastic gallon container placed on a porch. Investigators asked the surrounding fire departments to compile a list of all suspicious fires over the past year that started on the front porch of a home between 2 and 6 o'clock in the morning. The results were astonishing. There were 20 additional fires, all set when people were inside the homes.
This has been going on for a year or 2 years, and we want to know now what's going on. We want the answers.
Tragically, one of those fires claimed a life. 86-year-old Lou Edna Jones was unable to get out of her home and died of smoke inhalation. She had 5 children, 15 grandchildren, and 20 great-grandchildren. All were traumatized by this senseless act of violence.
I have been so heartbroken. I will never be the same again. Since that, and I mean the way she left here, a senseless death, because someone wanted their kids to sit back and watch a fire. How cold-hearted could you be?
This is a first-degree murder. We knew that not only had he killed one person that we knew of in the past, was it going to happen again?
The ATF and the local fire investigators formed a task force to find the arsonist setting the Washington, D.C. fires. There were 20 fires set with plastic gallon containers full of gasoline and cloth socks used as wicks. To gain some insight into the identity of the arsonist, investigators called in Ron Tunkel, an ATF criminal profiler.
How a person acts in the commission of their crimes is a reflection of how they will act in their day-to-day non-criminal lives. When we look at a crime scene, we're looking for the more emotional clues left behind at the crime scene.
In this case, the fires were set in predominantly black neighborhoods. For Tunkel, this was a crucial piece of information.
We're probably dealing with a black offender. A white offender, an Asian offender probably would have stood out.
Tunkel believed the arsonist was very skilled and organized, most likely a male in his late 20s to early 40s, and was probably unmarried since the fires were set between 2 and 6 o'clock in the morning. Investigators were convinced that the arsonist followed his exploits on the news and knew that in one of his fires, he killed someone.
Setting so many fires, terrorizing so many people. He's right up there with some of the great criminal minds or terrible criminal minds that we've dealt with in the Washington area.
If we didn't take him off the street, he wasn't going to stop.
And that's what happened. A few months later, there was a fire in a nearby apartment building. Over 100 residents were evacuated safely. The fire started on the 4th floor using the incendiary device.
There were multiple 1-gallon containers with gasoline placed out throughout the hallway.
But this time, investigators got a badly needed break. One of the residents, 57-year-old Paul Dubois, had some suspicious burns on his hands, and his clothes smelled of gasoline. His apartment was on the 4th floor, where the fire started. Dubois had a PhD from Cornell University, was $8,000 behind in his rent, and was about to be evicted when the fire broke out.
Some people got very excited. Oh my, this is going to be the serial arsonist. When they arrested him, that was the guy, but that didn't ring right to me.
That's because the other fires were set to single-dwelling homes.
What was striking was that it was in his own apartment building, and we began to think that that was a little bit inconsistent with everything else that had happened up until that date.
And the incendiary device in Dubois' apartment building was different from the others. It didn't have a wick. Was it possible that Dubois was a copycat and learned how to make the device from media reports?
At one point, the media actually put the device on TV, what they thought was being used, and that was particularly hard for us to deal with as a task force, because now potentially anybody can go out there, recreate this, and we would not know if we were dealing with the arsonist or a copycat.
But while Dubois was in custody, the fires continued. Investigators concluded that Dubois set the fire in his apartment building, but that was it.
Mr. Paul Dubois was not the serial arsonist, however responsible for setting the fire at his apartment complex. Is not the arsonist we were looking for.
Well, we learned a lot about his background and his life, which was certainly colorful, but it was pretty clear within weeks, I would say, that this was not going to be the person that was responsible for these fires.
However, Dubois was convicted of setting his apartment building on fire and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Over the next 2 months, there was a fire every week. By this time, there were over 30 of them. Then, investigators found something. A piece of the cloth wick survived one of the fires. Was it possible that the arsonist may have left his DNA on the burnt cloth? If so, scientists hoped they could find it. In most of the fires set by the Washington, D.C. arsonist, the incendiary device went up in flames. But in one case, a piece of the wick, which was a cloth sock, survived. On a hunch, scientists swabbed the cloth with sterile water, put the swab in a vial, and added a digest buffer that eliminates everything except human cells. Miraculously, the sock contained skin cells, and they provided a DNA profile, presumably of the arsonist.
To have such good DNA results for an arson case is pretty remarkable. When you think about the quality of the evidence in terms of how burned or how much heat it may have been subjected to, it's excellent to be able to obtain results.
Why were skin cells on the sock? The arsonist hadn't laundered it. Unfortunately, the DNA profile did not match any in the database of known criminal offenders. But investigators got another huge break. 3 young men, coming home from work around 2 a.m., saw someone sitting on their porch. Initially, they thought he was a burglar and chased him away. Afterwards, they found a shopping bag with a plastic container filled with gasoline and a sock tied around the handle.
This is our chance. We finally have an eyewitness. Not only one, but we have 3. 3 witnesses that had a conversation with what in our minds was the serial arsonist.
Analysts went over every inch of the bag and the plastic container and got yet another break. They didn't find fingerprints, but sticking to the outside of the container was a single human hair.
So at that point, we had a hair. We didn't know where the hair came from.
The hair was consistent with an African American, and it contained the root. DNA testing of the hair root matched the DNA from the burned wick. The 3 men described the suspect as a middle-aged black male with short hair, approximately 6 feet tall. Police released this composite sketch to the media. But the arsons continued.
We realized as that process wore on that it was much more likely that this case was going to be solved forensically than through any sort of eyewitness testimony.
Then the arsonist changed his pattern. Instead of using white plastic shopping bags to carry the incendiary devices, he switched to black ones. These were uncommon.
The bottom of the black bag read in part, "Made in China for the Cornelius shop." That portion of the bag survived the fire.
The ATF spoke with the manufacturer in China and learned that only 2 stores in the Washington, D.C. area bought these black shopping bags. Both stores were in the general vicinity of the arson fires, and the owners agreed to help with the investigation.
The store owner provided us access to his store, to his products. We established 24-hour surveillance, physical and video surveillance on both of these locations.
And investigators came up with a way to individualize every bag the stores used.
The task force purchased a series of alphanumeric steel chips. These steel chips had thermal testing done on them and would survive future fire scenes.
They fastened a different numbered chip onto the bottom of each bag. If investigators found one of these chips at a fire, the number would identify the date, time, and location of the store, and security cameras would show every individual buying plastic gallon containers in that time frame. As the black bags were put into circulation, investigators discovered something else. An arson dog detected gasoline on a pair of military dress pants discarded across the street from one of the fires. They were the type worn by the Marines. Scientists swabbed the waistband and discovered human skin cells. The DNA profile of these skin cells matched the hair found on the incendiary device and the skin cells from the burned wick.
The arsonist either is a current member of the Marine Corps, a former member of the Marine Corps, or has a close association with the Marine Corps. So what do? We go to the Marine Corps.
Fire investigators contacted the Naval Criminal Investigation Service about the pair of Marine pants found across the street from one of the arson fires.
When we went down to the Naval Yard to meet with the NCIS investigators, I think we had fairly thin hopes that they were actually going to bring us a suspect.
But that opinion was a bit premature. Naval investigators said they, too, were searching for a serial arsonist who had been setting fires to cars in a parking lot used by military personnel. A surveillance videotape showed a man leaving the scene in his car. From the license plate, he was identified as 55-year-old Thomas Sweat, a civilian who had a friend in the Marines. Sweat was unmarried and worked as the night manager of a fast food restaurant.
Never heard Thomas Sweat's name. When I found out who he was, I'd been in his restaurant, in that fast food restaurant in Northeast Washington. Many times I was there on the opening day of baseball in Washington. He probably served me or was there, but I didn't know it.
Sweat was never charged in the military fires because there was insufficient evidence against him.
There was not really enough information at this point of the investigation of Mr. Sweat to get a search warrant, to get court permission to get his DNA.
So the arson task force put Sweat under 24-hour surveillance. In doing so, they discovered Sweat lived near the food store that used the black shopping bags.
It's kind of like Christmas morning. You're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this. We might be finished with this.
When Sweat was brought in for questioning, he denied any involvement and willingly provided a DNA sample for testing.
Frankly, if he had not consented, that might have been a red flag where we would have focused even more heavily on Mr. Sweat. But he did consent, and that gave us the opportunity to do a fairly speedy analysis to see if he was in fact excluded or included as the serial arsonist.
His DNA matched the hair, the military pants, and the most incriminating of all, the skin cells on the burnt wick.
Mr. Sweat didn't realize that DNA can be recovered from a fire that he had previously set.
You got to remember, he's operating for a very long period of time, on the run, offending, eluding this massive manhunt. He may have been worn out, and that may have contributed.
When he learned of the DNA evidence against him, Thomas Sweat confessed to not only the recent fires, but some dating back 25 years.
It was a very emotional time. It was a very emotional interview. During that time, Mr. Sweat has provided us with over 350 fires in which he's responsible. The fact that Mr. Sweat had been undetected, had been untouched for a period of 25 years, he is a prolific serial arsonist.
This could potentially be the largest serial arsonist in the history of the United States.
2 people died in those fires, and dozens more were injured.
It was a pretty astounding moment for all of us. You always hope that the case is going to be solved, but when it actually happens, there's a kind of moment of stunned silence.
Investigators think Sweat had second thoughts about setting some of these fires, which explains why the young men saw him sitting on the porch. We'll never know what Sweat told investigators about the motive for the fires. He asked for and received a promise of confidentiality in exchange for his guilty plea. About the only thing that came out in court was that Sweat said he heard voices and that he set fires to relieve stress.
If the demons in your head told you to set a fire, if you were so stressed out that you had to set a fire, why didn't you set your own mother's house on fire? So see, that's why you can't say this man was insane. He had very good sense. He had sense enough not to get caught.
Thomas Sweat was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole, plus another 135 years in prison, all because of that rarest of forensic clues, DNA that survived the heat of a fire.
Just because of the nature of an arson scene, the nature of the fire, to find basically any evidence is remarkable. To find some DNA evidence that is usable DNA evidence and being able to have that evidence analyzed and go towards the case and to help solve that case is great.
The forensic evidence is proof that even in a fire, a criminal leaves some kind of trail. The trick is to find it.
There aren't many cases that are in history of this magnitude, and the investigative techniques that were used, the task force concept, how well it worked. I mean, it really is a model that you're not going to see in any other area.
In many respects, he was a guerrilla fighter, but he was up against a superior army, and there was no way he could win. So sooner or later, he would be caught.